Good afternoon. We will now resume with opening submissions by Mr. Scobie, King's Counsel. Mr. Scobie.
Thank you, sir. I appear along with Piers Marquis from Doughty Street Chambers and Paul Harron of the Public Interest Law Centre. In this tranche of the inquiry, we represent the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, Lindsey and Michael Chant. A complete and fully referenced version of this opening statement can be downloaded from the UCPI and Public Interest Law Centre websites. In our previous statements to the inquiry, we kept our focus on the evidence and have avoided making significant observations on the inquiry's procedure. However, the manner in which Tranche 2 has been prepared has left us unable to continue without making reference to the circumstances in which this statement has been drafted. The statement has been served in accordance with the inquiry's direction on Monday, the 24th of June 2024. The process of disclosure to the non-state core participants on the EPIC platform began on the 3rd of June 2024. In total, approximately 12,000 pages have been served since that date. The SWP was the most infiltrated organisation in Tranche 2. Lindsey was on the Central Committee of the SWP for the entire Tranche 2 period. Prior to this recent part of the disclosure process, the German had been served with just 42 documents. All of the remaining material in relation to the SWP has been served in the 2.5 weeks since the 6th of June 2024. There is still significant material outstanding, including all documents relating to HN 95, who was employed at the SWP headquarters in 1986 and who had extensive liaison with MI5. The witness statement on behalf of the security services was served on Friday, the 21st of June 2024. It is 105 pages long and, unsurprisingly, makes repeated reference to the SWP. The vast majority of the security service documents associated with that statement have not yet been served. Our insight into MI5's involvement has been limited to incomplete disclosure of liaison notes, which have been served piecemeal, officer by officer. We are clearly not in a position to make an opening statement on behalf of Lindsey German. We cannot read material that has not been served. We have not been given the time necessary to read the material that has been served. Plainly, if we do not have the time to even read material, we cannot consider and assess it, share it with our clients, take instructions on it, and then draft and present an opening statement to the standard that they deserve. We also raise at this stage the unfairness of Lindsey German being expected to provide oral evidence of the inquiry in these circumstances. Consequently, we have restricted our points in relation to Lindsey German and the infiltrations of the SWP and its Central Committee to a bare minimum. We ask for the opportunity to expand on those points in a further opening statement at the beginning of Phase 2 in October. In the circumstances, that cannot be an unreasonable request. In respect of Michael Chant, statement of the one officer who spied on the RCPB ML HN19 was not served till well after the deadline for the submission of his statement. We note that the security service has been on notice that it would be required to provide a statement on the Tranche 2 period since at least February 2020. They have had the Tranche 2 Rule 9 requests for over 12 months. Staff from across the security services, as well as legal advisors and counsel, worked on it for 8 months, supplying the inquiry with a closed version in February. It's taken a further 5 months to redact the statement. We've been given 1 weekend, consider it, without the benefit of the accompanying documents. This brings us to a wider point. The state core participants have had the benefit of time and considerable resources. They've had access to the material for years and have extensive teams of staff and lawyers. The police witnesses are retired on generous taxpayer-funded pensions. Most of our core participants are still working full-time. This imbalance has always existed in this inquiry. However, the approach to Tranche 2 is strongly suggestive of a deliberate attempt to silence the non-state core participants. To be clear, we are not aiming this criticism at the inquiry's legal team. The process of this inquiry has been delayed from the outset by the police core participants. The Home Office has used that delay to criticise the process of the inquiry and limit its time and resources. The impact of that has doubtless been to place intolerable pressure on the inquiry's lawyers. Inevitably, that pressure has been passed down the line to the non-state core participants and their legal teams. The result of that is to muzzle the victims of this state-sponsored policing. We call on the incoming government to have the courage to reverse this process in tranches 3 and 4, to commit to this inquiry, being given the time to ensure the victims are participants in more than name only. We will focus the rest of our opening statement on CND. It must be pointed out, whilst we received more disclosure at an earlier time for CND, the points made about the late disclosure of the security service material also plainly apply to them. We note that MI5 has been comparatively silent about their interest in CND and wholly silent about the SDS reporting on CND that they received between 1981 and 1986. There's been no material served by the Home Office or any other departmental customer of the SDS. MI5 and Home Office material is plainly fundamental for this inquiry to discover the truth about the SDS infiltrations of CND. That is a fact that they must both be very much aware of. The silence is telling. Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. CND was founded in 1958. It is well known as a broad church, democratic, mass membership organisation with groups across the United Kingdom and members from a broad section of society. CND is also well known for having conducted mass demonstrations on an enormous scale. All of the demonstrations have been peaceful. Prior to and going into the Tranche 2 period, CND posed no significant threat to public order. That fact is inescapable and was inevitably acknowledged by the inquiry at the outset. It was also well known that CND was not, by any definition, a subversive organisation. The very nature of its campaign made it clear it had no subversive intention. It was, and always has been, a single issue campaign. CND attempted to utilise parliamentary democracy to achieve its aim of nuclear disarmament. It would be perverse to conclude that in doing so, it wished to undermine parliamentary democracy. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, MI5 had maintained an interest in the organisation because some leading members were associated with the Communist Party of Great Britain. However, by the end of the 1970s, they had concluded, rightly, albeit later than most, that CND had no subversive intention. CND was not directly targeted by the SDS in the Tranche 1 period. At the dawn of the 1980s, that position changed. The British state spying on CND reached such a pitch that 2 examples leaked and became very public scandals. The way in which the British state dealt with those scandals informs their approach to this inquiry. Madeleine Hay. In 1981, a CND member, Madeleine Hay, was visited at her home by 2 police officers who claimed to be investigating a fraud. Her mortification at being associated with any kind of criminality led her to investigate her investigators. 3 years later, her determination led to an admission from Sir Philip Knights, the Chief Constable of the West Midlands Police. Those visiting officers were from Special Branch. They were investigating Mrs. Hay for her CND membership and the apparently subversive act of writing a letter to her local newspaper about cruise missiles. CND's reputation as a peaceful, broad church organisation was the main reason for the public outcry over the treatment of Madeleine Hay and the oppressive and repressive nature of this kind of policing. The Hague incident was a key driver for the Home Affairs Committee inquiry into the activities of Special Branch in 1984. The Home Affairs Committee had the Hague case in mind when they stated
Right. I'll just say what is happening. The connection with Mr. Scobie has broken. I am now going to pause to let it be reconnected. We will proceed when it is. I believe that we have now been reconnected. Mr. Scobie, I'm sorry you were interrupted. I haven't the faintest idea what happened, but these things do. You'd reached, according to my reading, the top of page 8 of your written opening.
Yes. I'll go from the top of page 8. If it's repetition, I'm sorry. The Hague incident was a key driver for the Home Affairs Committee inquiry into the activities of Special Branch in 1984. The Home Affairs Committee had the Hague case in mind when they stated special branches of the police forces have been in danger of acquiring a sinister reputation of a force which persecutes harmless citizens for political reasons, acts in nefarious ways to assist the security services, is accountable to no one, and represents a threat to our civil liberties. The Association of Chief Police Officers assured that inquiry, A, that data on individuals or organisations was not collected or held solely on the basis that such a person or organisation supports unpopular causes, that chief officers paid close attention to ensure that information was only recorded if it had a subversive or public order function, and C, that Special Branch would not thaw a whole organisation because some members may be considered subversive. The Metropolitan Police's own Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Colin Hewitt, assured the committee that it was certainly not true that records were kept on politically active CND members. All in all, it was presented that Madeleine Hague was very much an isolated case, and that the officers in question were just overzealous. DAC Hewitt's final assurance was that the police do not engage in lots of other activities which are quite improper. The police position was supported by assurances from the Home Office. According to the Home Secretary, Leon Britton, it was manifestly untrue that someone who was not breaking the law and did not plan to could be watched and have files opened on them. It was made crystal clear that CND could not possibly be considered to be subversive. The Madeleine Hague incident was raised so often by those who wished to criticise special branches because there was no other evidence of them doing anything wrong. The Home Secretary gave evidence accompanied by a Home Office civil servant, Michael Partridge. Leon Britton stated that anyone who was concerned they might be spied upon by the state just had to ask themselves a simple set of questions. What have I got to do to be the subject of a special branch interest? Do I threaten the safety or well-being of the state? Well, hardly that. On top of that, do I intend to overthrow or undermine parliamentary democracy? Well, hardly that. If I put the two together, do I come within that? Well, certainly not. The concept of parliamentary privilege prevents us from questioning the integrity of the evidence given in the course of those committee hearings. Counsel to the inquiry pointed out in his closing address in Tranche 1 that such issues are a matter for Parliament. We hope that in the context of the Tranche 2 evidence, the inquiry will join us in proposing that the next Parliament does investigate its own process in respect of that Home Affairs Committee report. The evidence given to that committee enabled the continuance of the SDS. As a matter of historical context, as of the 17th of April 1985, when the report was published, the committee congratulated itself on having dispelled the myths that had surrounded Special Branch for so long. He reassured the public that there was nothing for anyone to worry about. Kathy Massiter. In 1981, the same year that West Midlands Special Branch were visiting Madeleine Hague, an experienced MI5 desk officer, Kathy Massiter, was put in charge of the security services desk that covered CND. in 1983, she left the security service because of her disquiet over MI5's intrusive and oppressive monitoring of citizens, particularly in the trade unions and the peace movement. In early 1985, Kathy Massiter blew the whistle. The journalist Jeffrey Seed produced a documentary for Channel 4's 2020 Vision series titled MI5's Official Secrets. On the 20th of February 1985, only 3 weeks after the police and Home Office had given evidence to the Home Affairs Committee, the Independent Broadcasting Authority banned the broadcast of the programme. They were concerned that broadcast would lead to prosecution under the Official Secrets Act. The documentary was finally broadcast on the 8th of March 1985. Kathy Massiter's chief concern in respect of CND was that the security services were engaging in the political arena, ramping up spying operations from 1981 in the run-up to the June 1983 general election. In the autumn 1982, the Labour Party had adopted unilateral nuclear disarmament at its national conference, and the party leader, Michael Foot, declared himself supporter of CND. In 1979, CND had 4,267 members. By April 1982, MI5 were reporting that CND was expanding at such a rate that the chairman, Bruce Kent, no longer knew precisely how large its membership was. The security service estimate was 30,000 national members and 250,000 local members. By 1983, the national membership had more than doubled to 75,000. CND became a mass dissenting movement and a powerful electoral force with the potential for changing policy and government. In January 1983, Michael Heseltine became the Defence Secretary. He visited Greenham Common Air Base in February. In March, he set up a Special Information Propaganda Unit, Defence Secretariat 19, or DS-19, with a specific purpose of combating CND's unilateralist message in the run-up to the June general election. To fulfill Mr. Heseltine's brief, DS-19 went straight to MI5, asking for information about the subversive political affiliations leading members of CND, including members of the National Council and people working for CND. The Director General of MI5, John Jones, gave in to MOD pressure to supply dirt on CND and gave DS-19 material they requested. On the 3rd and 4th of April 1983, the Conservative press ran articles suggesting the hard left ran CND. The articles named 28 individuals who were either leading members of CND or people who worked for CND, and attempted to suggest their motivations were political. On the 22nd of April 1983, Michael Heseltine sent a letter to Conservative candidates in marginal seats for use when electioneering. He repeated the narrative used in press campaigns, stating that behind the carefully turned phrases about peace lies the calculated political professionalism of full-time socialists and communists. He referred to a conspiracy of the left that is now the driving force distorting the language of peace. On the 23rd of April, Mr. Heseltine delivered a televised speech in which the same language was repeated. It was this that led to Kathy Massiter's resignation. She said the security service stated specifically that CND was basically a broad-based organisation drawing support from a very wide range of political opinion. As far as Kathy Massiter was concerned, MI5 was providing information on a party political issue, and that was not a legitimate function of the security services because it directly contravenes the Charter. So she resigned, and in March 1985, she blew the whistle. Despite this, Kathy Massiter was never prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act. At the time, the consensus was that the acquittal of Clive Ponting in February 1985 discouraged the state from pursuing another prosecution. However, the disclosure in this inquiry suggests another explanation. In terms of the source of MI5's intelligence on CND, the focus of Kathy Massiter's revelations was on MI5's use of telephone taps and the placing of an MI5 agent inside CND's headquarters. The agent was said to have been an elderly former Communist Party member named Harry Newton. According to Kathy Massiter, his first job inside CND was to attend the CND National Conference in November 1982 and report as soon as possible after the conference who the new people on the National Council were, so that MI5 could pass the information on to interested parties in Whitehall. After that conference, Newton was said to have volunteered at CND's head office and became MI5's eyes and ears. He provided very general information about what was going on inside CND headquarters, fairly low-level stuff, internal CND documents and papers, and a diagram of the layout of the offices. The clear implication of the broadcast of the Massiter revelations was that Harry Newton, after November 1982, was a significant source of the material passed to DS19 in March 1983. However, the security service brief to the SBS officer, John Kerry, makes it clear that the last material that MI5s themselves sourced from within CND's head office was in October 1982. If Harry Newton was their agent, his November 1982 conference report was not his first job, but it was very close to being his last. The following month, Harry Newton was so unwell that he had to move back to Yorkshire, far away from CND's head office in Goodwood Street. He died a few months later. In January 1983, MI5 were asking SDS directly for details of the new National Executive Committee of CND. They made a similar and more detailed request at the end of April. Requests of a similar nature followed in 1983, 1984, 1985. So, whilst Kathy Massiter may have given a source, she gave a dead source. She did not give up the real source inside CND. MI5, of course, knew that, as did the Metropolitan Police. The real source was a Metropolitan Police officer using the name John Kerry. The broadcast revelations focused on MI5. In respect to Special Branch, they went no further than a passing line from the narrator. Kathy Massiter says there were other agents inside CND put there by special branches around the country. A line that says to the British state that she knew more, but to avoid prosecution would not be saying. It is the first time that the existence of the SDS and its regional equivalents were publicly alluded to. It predated the True Spies documentary series by 17 years. The lack of detail on special branch agents inside CND meant that no further evidence could be given to the Home Affairs Committee, which in March 1985 had not yet concluded its report. Had the full revelations been made, the Home Affairs Committee could not have come to the conclusion that they had dispelled myths and there was nothing to worry about. Instead, the minority view of that committee would have held sway. Two of the 8 voting committee members, David Winnick, MP, and Claire Short, MP, did not support the committee's conclusions. Instead, they concluded that the civil liberties of a number of individuals had been undermined by the actions of the special branches and the intelligence services. They deplored the fact that such activities had occurred and in all likelihood continued to occur. They called for a change in the MI5 Harris definition of subversion, which allowed too wide a discretion to special branch, and a reversion to the Lord Denning definition of that concept. They decried the total lack of parliamentary scrutiny over these government agencies, and they called for an independent commission of inquiry into the practices and records of special branch. An inquiry 34 years before this one was called, and 39 years before the public disclosure of the true extent of the SDS infiltration of CMD. The Masseter revelations must have been terrifying for special branch, all the more so because they came before the Home Affairs Committee finalised their report. We gleaned some insight from a 1998 document in relation to Lee Bonce's deployment into CND and the wider peace movement. 1998 document. At the height of CND activities, a number of potentially embarrassing exposés occurred. Most notably, the former Security Service officer, Kathy Masseter, who questioned the service's investigation into the activities of CND members. This produced widespread media interest. Clearly, any revelation of police involved in such groups would equally create considerable embarrassment. Embarrassment is the Metropolitan Police's favourite understatement. The SDS would and should have been finished in 1985. How they were allowed to get away with it should be a major focus of this inquiry, parliamentary privilege or not. In their Tranche 1 closing statement, the non-state core participants group proposed that David Winnick and Claire Short be called to give evidence at this inquiry. Obtaining new evidence via the Rule 9 process is a way of sidestepping parliamentary privilege and ensuring the inquiry is not restricted in its search for the truth. Leon Britton and DAC Hewitt are both dead. However, as we understand it, Michael Partridge from the Home Office, now Sir Michael Partridge, KCB, is not. He should recall. The Home Office are aware of the evidence that was given on their behalf to the Home Affairs Committee. They are aware of the evidence that has been given to this inquiry. It is their responsibility and moral duty to ensure that this inquiry is enabled to consider evidence of such clear importance. The SDS in CND. Kathy Masseter's revelations were groundbreaking. She was both brave and principled to have made them. But they were the tip of the iceberg. Kathy Masseter was the MI5 desk officer for CND from 1981. At first, CND mounted to roughly half of her work. 2.5 years later, CND was all of her work. Kathy Masseter's placement as the CND desk officer coincided with the deployment of John Kerry into CND in January 1981 and the visit to Madeleine Haig in July 1981. The increase in her workload exactly mirrored the increased interest in CND from the SDS. Kerry's reporting increased in 1981, and then again as he took positions of responsibility. in CND through 1982 and 1983. As his reports increased, so too did Cathy Massiter's workload. By the time she left the service in 1983, she would also have been receiving reports from Catherine Lee Bonser. MI5 had been given the details of the new peace woman, including a report on her progress and personal particulars in July 1983. Other officers reported on CND as a sideline from their main deployments. In the 1981 to 1983 period, these included, but were not limited to, Malcolm Shearing, Roger Pearce, and Alan Bond. All of their reports were sent to MI5 at Box 500. They would all have been passed over to Cathy Massiter's desk, taking up all of her time. As the MI5 desk officer for CND, Cathy Massiter would have known that the reports were from SDS police officers infiltrating the organisation. Harry Newton's short sojourn in 1982, chatting to Bruce Kent in the CND office, was not the news, as shocking as it was at the time. The real news was the detail behind the special branch officers infiltrating CND around the country, some of them embarking on 4-year undercover deployments. Harry Newton had not been needed to attend the CND National Conference in 1982 because John Kerry was already going. In fact, he'd already been the National Conference in 1981. Newton was not required to report back as soon as possible so that the information could be passed to Whitehall. In 1981, John Kerry provided a 106-page report within 15 days of the conference ending. John Kerry's 1982 conference report was 135 pages long and was completed within 16 days. Worth noting that John Kerry reported on 150 named individuals in that report. The list included people like Paul Ostreicher, with the special branch file dating back to 1962. Harry Newton's name was not there. Harry Newton was allegedly mailing things, doing odd jobs and reporting fairly low-level stuff. John Kerry, on the other hand, considered himself a trusted activist. He'd already provided details of CND headquarters and the location of the membership computer. He was providing MI5 with very detailed reports on meetings from CND National Council. He was attending council meetings of the London Region CND as Secretary Chair of CND's Hampstead Group. Harry Newton was a distraction. He was named as a source of information that, in all likelihood, he did not source. At the end of March 1983, when MI5 handed their material to DS19 for use in the government's election campaign, Harry Newton was long gone. John Kerry was 2 years into his 4-year deployment. John Kerry. When Madeleine Haig was being visited and lied to by special branch officers, John Kerry was actively deceiving CND members across London. He tricked his way into their homes, attending parties and having dinner, taking their drinks and food, as he abused their hospitality, generosity, and trust. He smoked joints with some members too, and then he reported them for doing the same. He watched Hawkwind with them at Glastonbury Festival, where he can only be reasonably certain that he did not share a tent. Taxpayer covered this overtime, and John Kerry's take-home pay increased significantly. At the time, the UCOs were earning as much as $25,000 a year, which was over 3 times the national average wage. For each officer who abused the trust of our citizens, 4 nurses would have been saving lives in hospitals. Amongst other things, John Kerry reported on people's sexual relationships and sexual activity, personal family details, employment details, parentage and ethnicity. He reported on hundreds, if not thousands of people, most of whom had no police records or special branch files, and no legitimate reason to have them. He reported on Christian CND's Peace Pentecost weekend, ex-services CND, World War I procession. He reported details of tree planting and of a children's peace party. His reports joined those of other officers, such as Alan Bond's reporting on Tooting CND and their plans for a badge making and face pasting event, a drawing competition and CND balloon sale. All of those reports were sent to MI5. Public order and subversion rationales. John Kerry maintains that he was not initially tasked into CND. He says there had been plans to deploy him into the SWP or IMG, but ultimately he was deployed without a target. His first report was on the peace movement in Hampstead. There then followed about 4 months of reporting on the campaign against racist laws, during which time he managed to get himself appointed as temporary secretary of the North London branch. He also appears to report on the Labour Party conference in March 1981, although the report from that event has not been disclosed. But from May 1981, John Kerry was reporting exclusively on CND. He says that his infiltration of CND came about because of the potential for elements within the campaign to use NVDA, non-violent direct action tactics. He says that he identified the potential for public disorder that could arise through NVDA by activists and those on the fringes of CND. And once he had, his infiltration of Hampstead CND was agreed with his managers. In his second statement, John Kerry maintains that he persuaded Detective Chief Inspector Dave Short to allow him to focus on CND. It would be truly remarkable if a detective constable were able to simply choose to infiltrate an organisation as politically sensitive as CND and persuade his managers that it was a good idea, particularly on grounds as spurious as non-violent direct action. The fringes of CND had been involved in non-violent direct action since CND's inception in the late 1950s, and yet the SDS did not infiltrate CND until 1981, which coincidentally was the same time the state's political interest in CND commenced. There was no pressing need for John Kerry to identify CND members' involvement in NVDA, when members had been engaging in it for 25 years. The undercover reporting makes it clear that much of the NVDA that members engaged in was publicised in advance. In any event, CND members ran open workshops on NVDA that covered issues such as the history and philosophy of NVDA, conflict de-escalation, non-violent communication, and legal rights. On John Kerry's own admission, NVDA activity was centred on Greenham Common. He could not get close to that, and the SDS already had an officer there. CND's association with non-violent direct action does not constitute a public order justification. The criminal law in respect of public order offences is intended to penalise the use of violence and or intimidation by individuals or groups. The SDS was ostensibly established to prevent a repeat of the 1968 violent disorder in Grosvenor Square. The existence of the SDS for that purpose was not justifiable. It was certainly not justifiable to prevent making holes in fences, taking part in a sitting, an occupation with dancing, hide-and-seeking picnics, or an event decorating an air-based fence with poems, flowers, and pumpkins. Any indication from John Kerry that criminal offences on process lent to more traditional policing purpose to his deployment do not stand scrutiny. The offences envisaged, such as obstructing a highway or breaching the peace, are less serious in the hierarchy of criminality in his own engagement in supplying cannabis as a police officer by passing a joint. CND's commitment to non-violence has always been essential to its core principles. MVDA, by its nature and name, is non-violent. Try to equate CND member actions with real public disorder is desperate and disingenuous. Retrospectively, John Kerry's own account has to recognise that CND did not pose a significant risk of public disorder. His suggestion that elements within CND and fellow travellers alongside it could potentially pose a public order challenge is hollow. It is a matter of historical and police record. CND, with its broad-based support and array of fellow travellers, has never posed a risk to public order. In any event, the fellow travellers were already heavily infiltrated by SDS officers. Reports of those officers overwhelmingly suggest their target groups had very little interest in CND demonstrations. John Kerry's reporting kept up the appearance of gathering intelligence on alleged subversives by occasionally mentioning Trotskyists and anarchists. But the CND infiltration told the police less about their approach to the peace movement than the other, also unjustified SDS infiltrations. In any event, as early as February 1982, John Kerry had been clear that purported subversive organisations such as the SWP and IMG were smaller than Labour and Christian groups in CND, with no foreseeable likelihood of their influence growing, particularly on the National Council. The officers that infiltrated CND regularly reported that demonstrations were expected to be entirely peaceful, that CND liaised with police in advance of those demonstrations and had large contingents of organised and trained stewards. One of the least attractive arguments put forward by the police is that reports indicating no disorder are as valuable to policing as reports of disorder. Logically speaking, it gives license for the police to spy on everyone. Geoffrey Kraft called this the ultimate defence line. The respect of CND has no merit at all. Anyone on any street at any time in the 1980s could have told the police the conclusion that John Kerry came to at the end of his deployment. In his own words, there was no real threat of public disorder. John Kerry's account of a public order motivated deployment does not make any sense. A more accurate description of the purpose of John Kerry's deployment, in his own words, is that he was providing a long-term assessment of the organisation that informed the state's approach to it. John Kerry is certainly right. The long-term assessment was flawed. His infiltration of CND lasted from May 1981 to December 1984. It overlapped with that of Lee's sponsor, who was deployed from June 1983 until March 1986, and Timothy Spence. Timothy Spence was deployed into the field in October 1983. His first report on CND was in February 1984, and he continued to report on them until November 1986. There are SDS reports covering every single one of the CND national conferences in that 6-year period. Timothy Spence's deployment was unusual in the sense that he was initially targeted into an area rather than a group. A targeting discussion between the SDS and MI5 indicates that Hackney was apparently so subversive as to warrant a deployment targeting the borough itself. Hackney Community Relations Executive was the proposed starting point. Timothy Spence entered Hackney and reported on a number of police monitoring and justice campaigns, community groups and lawyers. Like his fellow CND infiltrators, Timothy Spence also reported on the local council. Hackney Borough Council allowing local CND to use the library as a meeting place was worthy of a report. Whether Timothy Spence himself knew it or not, his deployment was clearly targeted at managing dissent. As MI5 and SDS had discussed, Timothy Spence fired a more defined target at the beginning of 1984, when he started to infiltrate CND. After John Kerry's exfiltration, CND became Timothy Spence's focus. Timothy Spence is also unusual because, for the most part, his account of his deployment appears to be refreshingly honest. He is very clear that the groups he reported on were not subversive. The highest point is that there was a potential through marches and obstruction of the highway, which he rightly acknowledges would have been minor infringements of the law. Equally, Lee Bonser did not see a public order justification for her deployment. Her targets in CND and then Lambeth Women for Peace and Greenham Common were always peaceful. Public order threat went no further than a disruptive sitting, which could have caused problems for pedestrians or traffic. Bonser is also clear that her targets could not have been said to be subversive. It was simply against nuclear bombs and probably would have preferred a Labour government. Timothy Spence says there was a general interest in CND from both MI5 and Special Branch, a view which accords with John Kerry's view of an assessment in the interest of the state. This is also borne out by the MI5 and SDS liaison documents over the 6 full years that CND was directly infiltrated by the SDS. MI5 did not need telling that CND was not even a potentially subversive organisation, because they already knew. But if the SDS was slow on the uptake, even they were clear in March 1984 at a meeting with 4 MI5 officers that there was no ring of subversives unduly influencing the democratic structure of CND. Despite that knowledge, the SDS continued to improve its coverage of CND and report the details of the organisation's membership and finances. In July 1984, SDS management expressed concern that having 3 officers in CND was too much. However, MI5 were well satisfied with the information they were receiving. They were also so concerned at the considerable gap that John Kerry's retirement would leave, particularly the loss of his valuable access to London CID, that they pressed for him to be retained after his expected exfiltration date. In October 1982, MI5 had told the SDS they no longer put much effort into finding agents in certain organisations, such as the SWP, because the SDS had so many officers there. By July 1984, with such extensive SDS coverage of CND, it is possible that MI5 took a similar approach. 1994, Stella Remington said on record, the allegation that the service investigated organisations which were not in themselves subversives is quite untrue. She did not mention that the SDS were doing it for them. By November 1984, the same SDS management was declining MI5 proposals to move Timothy Spence into an SWP infiltration and insisting that he be John Kerry's successor in CND. Timothy Spence was the last undercover officer in CND. The SDS attempted to obtain MI5 support for a successor to him in October 1986. The security service were by now adamant there was no requirement. The SDS penetration of CND continued as the Home Affairs Committee deliberated, despite a clear recognition in Special Branch that it was highly problematic in the light of that investigation. Similarly, the penetration continued as Channel 4 broadcast the Cathy Master revelations. In fact, on the very day that the documentary aired, Timothy Spence was reporting that as secretary of the Hackney CND group, he was a signatory to their bank account. Interestingly, having been sent to MI5, this particular report has this report was returned as not being of security interest. Previously, similar reports, including only one 6 months before from Lee Bonser, had not been returned. Similarly, Timothy Spencer's report on the 1985 CND National Conference has a handwritten note indicating that the Treasurer's report on finances had been destroyed on receipt by MI5. MI5 had certainly not been so concerned about keeping copies of Treasurer's reports in 1982 and 1984. It appears that having taken the brunt of the media attention post-Massacre, MI5 at least wanted to be a little more careful in what they were accepting. The SDS, on the other hand, were relatively unscathed by the Massacre revelations. Ultimately, the Home Affairs Committee went the way that Special Branch had wanted. It would have been incredibly worrying for them at the time. There's been extremely limited disclosure of internal police documentation on the issue. However, one document gave an insight into the level of concern that the documentary would have caused them. In September 1989, Special Branch received intelligence that journalist Geoffrey Seed was getting close to them again and planning another documentary. This time, he'd been in contact with a former member of Big Flame, the very person who had confronted SDS officer Rick Clark with his birth and death certificates in 1976. He had offered Seed a photograph of Clark and some papers on the subject. Those papers would, doubtless, have been the file that Richard Chesson told the inquiry about. They included the birth and death certificates of the real Rick Gibson, as well as the scrawled note that Clark had written to his girlfriend in Big Flame. That would have been the first evidence of SDS sexual relationships with activists. If it had been published then, Mary would have known the truth far sooner than she did. Every sexual relationship post-1989 would not have happened. Bea and Jenny, and every woman abused by an SDS officer thereafter would not have had to experience this inquiry. Special Branch went into overdrive. Commander Ops was immediately informed. Arrangements were made through S-Squad for the situation to be monitored closely and for any future relevant tapes to be made available for scrutiny. Had Mr. Seed been taped since 1985? On whose authority? The documentary was never made and the file has never come to light. Managing dissent. This inquiry has so far refrained from expressing any view about the proposition that the SDS was one of the instruments set up by a conservative state to suppress the aspirations of those who wish to produce radical change by political means. The inquiry has cited limited evidence as the rationale. However, the inquiry now has evidence of deployments served no viable or even remotely arguable justification on public order or subversive grounds. In addition, there is evidence that the state endorsed and orchestrated a long-term, deeply intrusive penetration despite that lack of justification. Putting aside the background to the Home Affairs Committee, we are not permitted to question due to parliamentary privilege, there is evidence that the state prevented parliamentary scrutiny of its activity. In the face of that, this inquiry will have to answer these questions. Why was an open, broad church, single-issue organisation with a decades-long reputation for peaceful protest suddenly infiltrated in 1981? And why was it that that organisation was so extensively and persistently penetrated until 1986? Kathleen Massacre was clear that the increased interest in CND was political. There was a reason for the increased workload. CND was a politically sensitive issue. The difference is a political one. The state's particular interest in CND began in 1981 the same time that CND became a mass dissenting movement capable of changing policy and potentially government. The language used in the SDS annual reports is reflective of that. In 1981, the stated concern was that CND would prevent the implementation of government policy. In 1982, that CND would pose a more direct challenge to the government. In 1983, CND's widespread national support was a focus. In 1984, CND's size was the concern. Labour policy of unilateral disarmament and increasing public awareness was specifically cited as the drivers for the increased membership. CND was said to have skillfully manipulated public opinion. Aside from the obvious irony of that statement, the subtext is that the concern could be assuaged by a skillful manipulation of public opinion in the opposite direction. The infiltrations were clearly political and were examples of the state approach to managing dissent. Positions of responsibility. At the close of Tranche 1, on behalf of Richard Chester, Marion and Lindsey German, we set out detailed submissions on the evidence of officers attaining positions of responsibility in the organisations that they infiltrated. We set out the extent of SDS management, knowledge and endorsement of this particular tactic, as well as inevitable implications to an organisation when undercover officers take on such roles. Chief Inspector Jeff Craft's method in the troops out movement included a set routine. The undercover officer 1 infiltrated a branch, 2 ensured election to chair or secretary position in that branch, 3 used that position to guarantee a delicate role to regional meetings, and 4 used presence at those meetings to gain a delicate position to national meetings. That pattern was exactly replicated by both John Kerry and Timothy Spence in their infiltration to CND. Both John Kerry and Timothy Spence repeated the standard UCO line about accidentally taking these positions of responsibility. This is a corporate line that is taken precisely because the tactic is so obviously destabilising and anti-democratic. John Kerry's appointment as temporary secretary of the Campaign Against Racist Laws only happened, he says, because he didn't look down quickly enough and was deemed to have volunteered. He did not seek the role he then obtained at Hampstead CND. He was just chosen to fulfil it. He downplayed the position he took by describing it as a facilitator and said that he was disappointed that the security service documents consistently refer to him as chairman of the Hampstead branch of CND. There was no such role of facilitator in any CND group. MI5 referred to John Kerry as chairman because that is what he was. The chairman was in charge of the group and the role gave him delicate access to the London region. John Kerry says that his attendance at London CND council meetings should not be overstated because the council only met to share news of events and occasionally to organise London-wide events. But MI5 were particularly pleased with his attendance as a devoted campaigner at those meetings and his access to the London regional office. John Kerry's own reporting was clear. The London Council was a stepping stone in the hierarchy of national CND. His position and presence there eased his route into the national conferences that he and Timothy Spence reported on every year. In June 1983, John Kerry was also the chief steward of an important and highly publicised piece of non-violent direct action involving the linking of hands with the Soviet and US embassies. John Kerry states that the chief steward title is grander than his actual responsibilities on the day, which were effectively setting up the dais and loud speakers. This new account is contradicted by his own report from the time. which details his involvement in arranging the timetable for the event, including stewards' meetings, and ensuring that all stewards were correctly positioned along the route. His report details the concern by the organisers that the numbers attending might well exceed their requirements and could reach 50,000 demonstrators. To be chief steward at a CND demonstration in London is an enormous responsibility. It is key to ensuring that routes and agreements are kept to and that public order is maintained. John Kerry gave his copy of CND notes for marshals and stewards to his superiors in the SDS. That document made it clear that all stewards were to behave as ambassadors for CND, with a responsibility for ensuring that the demonstrations were peaceful and successful. On this occasion, downplaying the role has not served John Kerry well. If setting up loudspeakers is all he did, when he should have been making sure that that demonstration went as planned, then he put CND at grave risk of tarnishing their unblemished reputation for exceptional stewarding and entirely peaceful demonstrations. For an organisation such as CND, having a chief steward who does not do his job in a highly publicised flagship demonstration is almost as dangerous as the destabilising actions undertaken by Rick Gibson and the Troops Out movement. As John Kerry's successor, Timothy Spence exactly mirrored his progress. This was clearly the intention, as a liaison note in July 1984 between MI5 and SDS makes clear. Timothy Spence became secretary of the Hackney CND group. He also downplays the role. He does not recall taking the position, when he took it, or how he came to take it. Yet, Timothy Spence's own reporting recognises the obvious importance of his role. His early reporting from Hackney Group CND blames low membership on group leadership. By March 1985, 6 months after he reported that disaffection, he was group secretary himself. Immediately after that, he was reporting on the London Region Executive and Council meetings and AGM. Like John Kerry before him, he also downplayed that attendance. There's an interesting example of the importance of group secretaries in Timothy Spence's reporting. September 1986, London Region CND were proposing to send a peace delegation to Moscow. They sent letters to the group secretaries across London, asking for both their views on the idea and for funding. The response was disappointing, as there were only 2 replies. Acton CND opposed the idea, but the Hackney group, Timothy Spence, encouraged it, but refused funding. CND declared that John Kerry and Timothy Spence took roles that were important in terms of communication, meetings, membership, coordination, recruitment, support, and representation. In the case of Rick Clark's deployment into the Troops Out movement, the evidence conclusively demonstrated that SDS was knowingly used to destabilise, and in that case, attempt to decapitate democratic movement. CND was a much larger organisation. No officer could have done that level of damage in a 4-year deployment. And of course, Rick Clark's exposure as an undercover officer had taught the SDS a lesson about taking too high a role. But it's interesting that Jeff Craft's fingerprints are all over the style of these officers' progression up the CND hierarchy. Craft had been the SDS inspector for Clark's deployment. For John Kerry's deployment, he was the chief superintendent of Special Branch with overall responsibility for the SDS, which he described as his biggest responsibility. When Craft left that role and handed over to Chief Superintendent Tucker, MI5 was still very happy with SDS coverage of the Troops Out movement, and there were 3 SDS officers inside CND. When he gave evidence in Tranche 1, Craft denied all knowledge of Rick Clark's movement up and activity in the hierarchy of the Troops Out movement, despite having signed off almost all of the reports. In respect of CND, despite being in charge of 3 of the most politically sensitive, politically driven deployments in SDS history, he denied all knowledge of any CND officer other than Lee Bonson. He was unable to assist his inquiry into why John Kerry was deployed. Furthermore, he was unable to assist with whether there had been pressure put on the SDS from the government and the Home Office to deploy these officers into CND. His evidence did not square with his own report in February 1984 that the SDS had obtained first-class information in 1983, particularly in the troublesome anti-nuclear area. John Kerry's Detective Inspector Trevor Butler, who also gave evidence in Tranche 1, said he had no dealings with anybody reporting back on the CND, despite having signed off many of John Kerry's reports. We reiterate an aspect of our Tranche 1 closing. One way to ensure the inquiry concludes there is limited evidence of a proposition is for the police to refuse to give it. Counter, subversion, and disruptive assistance. An important feature of the Tranche 1 evidence was the Cabinet Office disclosure indicating that various interdepartmental groups in government were customers of the SDS, be they direct as a result of special branch membership of those groups from 1972, or circulated via the Security Service as a product of their intimate relationship. The purpose of these groups was not simply to gather intelligence, but to use it for what they called counter-subversion. Certainly, in the mid-1970s, the Metropolitan Police were attendees at these group meetings or recipients of their reports and minutes. Other named attendees were representatives of the Cabinet Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Home Office, Departments of Education and Employment, and of course, the Security Service. One of the methods that was explicitly discussed was the manipulation of the mainstream media, or as the state called it, the enlivening of the home information machine, especially in relation to the press. The disclosed Cabinet Office documents detailed a number of examples of the state's media manipulation to further its ends. MI5 certainly had not been averse to engaging in that kind of activity throughout the 1970s. In early April 1983, when the Conservative press ran articles as part of the DS19 propaganda campaign against CND, they named 28 individuals who were either leading members of or worked for the organisation. John Kerry had reported on 24 of those 28 members in his 1982 National Conference report. One of the 28 was reported on in a March 1983 document from John Kerry, listing the results of the London Regional CND Executive Committee election. Incidentally, that report was signed off by none other than Chief Superintendent Jeff Crum before it was sent to MI5. Another John Kerry report from February 1983 details the meeting of the CND National Council on the 15th and 16th of January 1983, in which the 1983 national officers were elected. It named 11 of the 28. In total, these three reports, all exactly contemporaneous to the DS19 campaign, reported on 27 of the 28 members named in the press. In defense of the authorized history of the security services, MI5 claimed that the material they gave to DS19 in March 1983 related to only 7 members of CND and was open source. Similarly, the MI5 whistleblower Annie Machin wrote that in 1983 the service had refused requests from Michael Heseltine to hand over CND membership lists and details of members' political activities. That in itself raises some interesting questions. The Ministry of Defence must have had its own researchers capable of accessing open source material. They would not have gone to MI5 asking for material that they already had access to themselves. When the approach was made by the MOD, they must have been conscious that their request involved asking MI5 to breach the Maxwell 5 directive. They clearly expected the directive to be breached, and if the authorized MI5 account of the information given is correct, it was breached. But if MI5 did only give them open source information on 7 names, DS19 must have been sorely disappointed. The MOD wanted contemporaneous information on the CND leadership as of the spring of 1983. Can it simply be a coincidence the DS19 press included not 7 names but 28, and the SDS had recently reported on 27 of them? There's been no disclosure of a list of the SDS customers. If DS19 obtained nothing of any use from MI5, there was nothing to stop them going directly to the Metropolitan Police. In relation to the Madeleine Hague incident, Sir Philip Knights made it clear that West Midlands Special Branch had received previous requests directly from the Home Office to make inquiries, like those involving Mrs. Hague. He said that he had turned them down. But the SDS had been generating reports that could not conceivably have any other purpose other than the party political. In October 1982, John Kerry submitted a report stating that London Regional CND prepared a plan for campaigning in the next general election. There would be a pilot campaign in February 1983, petitioning and leafleting the Prime Minister's constituency. An election fund would be set up and members would be asked to pledge time to election campaigning. Another report from February 1983 deals with CND's awareness from the press. The Conservative Party was using a publicity agency to counter CND arguments. The SDS report details a member of John Kerry's Hampstead group saying they knew someone who worked for the agency and would ask them to give advance notice of publicity campaigns. In July 1982, John Kerry was reporting a forthcoming CND day school with discussions on how to counter media bias against CND. These documents are stark examples of reporting, not on subversion, but on engagement in the process of parliamentary democracy. They were signed off by Chief Superintendent Nigel Short and sent for onward distribution. We know they were sent to MI5 because it was the security services who provided the reports to the inquiry. We do not know where else they were sent because the Metropolitan Police had destroyed their copies and their front sheets. They're clearly of no use to anyone other than the Conservative government and a state interested in preserving the status quo. They have no purpose other than electioneering. There are only 2 customers who would have considered them of any value. Whilst DS19 was seeking dirt on CND, Lee Bonser was approached and asked to join the SDS with the specific intention of infiltrating the Green and Peace campaign. She was asked directly by a superintendent who told her that the Prime Minister herself wanted to know what the Green women were doing and asked if she would help the police find out. The Prime Ministerial request was in February or March 1983, coincidentally exactly at the same time that DS19 was seeking dirt they could not obtain from MI5. Jane Hickman, the solicitor to some of the women at the Green and Common camp, observes in her statement to the inquiry that prior to March 83, the tabloid media had been fairly neutral in its reporting of the Greenland camps. That reporting then deteriorated into a concerted effort to dehumanise and demean camp occupants. Ms. Hickman notes the correlation between the content of some of those media reports and the reporting of Lee Bonser. Peter Francis had been clear, whilst deployed in Youth Against Racism in Europe in 1993, he gathered intelligence that could undermine support for those campaigning for Stephen Lawrence. He said, "I was asked the same as all other campaigners, is there anything the police could possibly use through the media to start maybe tarring the campaign? It means the amount of sympathy that campaign can generate is going to be vastly diminished." He said that using intelligence to smear a campaign was a general remit, and that is always our remit. We find out the intelligence, and if it is needed, it will be used. The Home Office. The Home Office knew of the SDS existence because they signed authorities for it every year. There is no doubt they were aware of and approved the extensive targeting of CND because they had cited the 1983 SDS annual report. There's evidence of an internal Home Office report being prepared in relation to the SDS's 1983 activity, but this has not been traced. The Home Office wanted to be sure that the SDS could be defended as a current response to current problems. In other words, they wanted to make sure that the targeting was appropriate in their view. Michael Partridge had written to the police proposing a discussion with Deputy Assistant Commissioner Hewitt to inform the Home Office about which group and activities were the current focus of the squad's work and how that is carried out. Partridge also noted the sensitivity of such undercover work. The 1983 report contained details on SDS personnel and targets and included clear reference to the infiltration of political and pressure groups. CND was given prominence and was described as undoubtedly the main street activity of the SDS that year. Having been made aware of the contents of the annual report, Michael Partridge is noted as confirming that he and Sir Brian Cubban were entirely content with the way the squad's role had adapted to changing circumstances. 6 months later, Partridge accompanied the Home Secretary, Leon Britton, when he gave evidence of the Home Affairs investigation to Special Branch. DAC Hewitt had also given evidence shortly before. It is also beyond doubt that the Home Office also read the 1986 annual report, which contained a significant section on CND and noted that this was a very sensitive area of police monitoring. Sir Michael Partridge signed off the Home Office authorisation for the SDS to continue in 1983, 1984 and 1985. He approved the funding without challenge to the budget request or scrutiny of expenditure, despite requests for funding increases that far outstripped inflation. The letter requesting authorisation in 1986 was also sent to him in his then role as Deputy Under Secretary of State. Sir Michael Partridge had also been a recipient of a letter from the security services detailing how, in advance of giving evidence to the Home Affairs Committee, the Home Office and police witnesses could concert tactics, agree lines to take, and avoid drawing attention to the points they wanted to cover up. It is beyond doubt the Home Office was aware of the detailed operational activity and all the groups infiltrated in 1983 and 1986. It is inconceivable there would have been no discussions in the interim. The Home Office had categorically and enthusiastically endorsed the infiltration of CND by undercover officers. As the Deputy Under Secretary of State, Michael Partridge, as he is now, was interviewed by Stephen Taylor for the 2015 report on the links between SDS and Home Office. We do not know whether he was asked about the knowledge of the SDS and the evidence given to the Home Office Home Affairs Committee. We do know that there was very little recollection of anything related to the SDS, save for an unnamed official who was in post in 1984, who was able to recall discussions on the SDS with the Commander and Deputy Assistant Commissioner at the time. That official was apparently unable to recall the detail. We also know that the key file, which contains the evidence of Home Office interaction in relation to the SDS, 1968 to 2008, probably no longer exists, and there is no record of what happened to it. Stephen Taylor was not able to conclude whether that is human error or deliberate concealment. No records remained in the Home Office covering the whole 40-year existence of the SDS, save the 24 letters dealing with the annual reports and funding. We do not know whether Michael Partridge informed Leon Britton of the extent of his knowledge of the SDS, because there are no records. However, Partridge's successor as Deputy Under Secretary of State, Sir John Chilcot, certainly informed the Home Secretary Douglas Hurd in 1988. Chilcot had read the 1986 report and discussed its contents with Special Branch at the time. He then received letters outlining the work of the SDS in 87 and 88 and authorised funding accordingly. When Chilcot referred the work of the SDS to Douglas Hurd, the Home Secretary is noted as having expressed his approval. In June 1989, when Chilcot was still Deputy Under Secretary and Douglas Hurd was still Home Secretary, the annual link to the Home Office was severed. The Home Office still considered the SDS valuable, but the Home Office had no further need to know the source and management aspects, unless something of real concern occurs. We do not know why the Home Office took this view at this stage. However, it is readily apparent that a new approach to funding ensured that the paper trail between the SDS and the Home Office would completely dry up. When there are no records, there is no evidence. However, in 1993, the Home Secretary, Michael Hurd, was due to personally attend the SDS office with the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. The absence of documents does not equate to an absence of knowledge. Both Douglas Hurd and Michael Hurd can assist this inquiry in respect of the key issues of government knowledge. If the inquiry has not already done so, they should both be required to provide evidence of their knowledge. We understand the Home and Cabinet Office material will be served at a later undisclosed date for consideration at the end of Tranche 3. In their Tranche 1 statement, the Security Service maintained that the pressure to investigate these organisations often came from the Prime Minister and from Whitehall. In the authorised history of MI5, it was noted that Margaret Thatcher took greater interest in the intelligence community than any Prime Minister since Winston Churchill. That wording suggests an interest in the wider intelligence community. It is apparent there was a significant interest in the murkier side of Special Branch. Dennis Skinner, MP, maintained in the 1980s Margaret Thatcher turned the police into her own private army. The CND infiltrations suggest an extension of that. The last point that we will make in relation to CND is the correlation between the start and end of the SDS and national opinion polls. In July 1982, the same time that John Kerry was reporting on a CND day school on countering bias in the media, national opinion polls suggested that 63% of the people in Britain were opposed to the decision to buy Trident, and 53% were against Polaris. By November 1986, 66% thought that Britain should continue to possess nuclear weapons. 49% supported the completion of the Trident programme, whilst only 39% supported unconditional removal. The weight of public opinion had shifted, and with it the threat to state and government policy that CND had posed. Timothy Spence completed his final report, and the SDS infiltration of CND was over. Additionally, CND was rapidly losing members, was becoming less of a perceived threat to the establishment. Cathy Massif's certainty that the reporting was political was not misplaced. Lindsey German and the Socialist Workers' Party. From the disclosures that we've been able to review, it is clear that the SDS continued their relentless infiltration of the SWP throughout the Tranche 2 period. Since 1973, MI5 had been obsessed with the idea of SDS officers obtaining a place in the SWP headquarters. In the Tranche 1 period, that obsession culminated in Colin Clark and Phil Cooper taking direction-setting positions in the party. And for 6 years, between 1978 and 1983, satisfying the MI5 orders of obtaining a permanent place in the party's centre. In the run-up to Phil Cooper's 1983 exfiltration, 2 new members were placed into the SWP, and MI5 affirmed their interest in the new national SWP office. SDS management emphasised how keen they were to find a way of replacing Phil Cooper in HQ, but were reluctant to follow the same method they had previously adopted, of having one undercover officer introduce and recommend another to the party. The SDS were hopeful that Alan Bond would make a name for himself in time. as he had recently become a committee member in Brixton SWP. MI5 had considered Phil Cooper to be the SDS's most difficult officer, but the levels of access that he had were set as a benchmark to be replicated. The fact that he had left the SWP having brewed a row at headquarters was positively reported. The SDS admitted they were finding their coverage of the SWP to be too extensive to justify. By May of 1984, regretfully informing MI5 there was no hope of more than 2 officers in the party. Further, they did not expect that either of the 2 current officers, Nick Green and Alan Bond, would make HQ in their time. By September 1984, MI5 were fretting about their lack of access to SWP HQ to such an extent they proposed that Timothy Smith be withdrawn from CND and use his position in Hackney to gain access to the SWP HQ instead. Alan Bond was also proven to be difficult, as he would not move from Croydon SWP, as he had been directed to do. At the time, Bond had embarked on a sexual relationship with a member of Croydon SWP, which perhaps explains the reluctance to move. Ultimately, Alan Bond did make it to HQ. He secured work there by pretending to be a carpenter. MI5 gleefully reported that he'd learned carpentry on the job from the Reader's Digest. September 1985, MI5 met Alan Bond whilst he was still a serving officer to discuss his continued access to SWP New HQ print shop complex and give him specific tasking. Alan Bond's last task before his exfiltration in November was to provide MI5 with extensive reports on the location of SWP's new office. All of those reports have been heavily redacted, no doubt to protect the tradecraft around the kind of building installation he had been required to do on MI5's behalf. The SDS proudly announced the great assistance they had given MI5 for the new SWP HQ in their 1985 annual report. When Alan Bond left, MI5 offered to do anything they could to help Stefan Veselowski progress in his SWP access. Now MI5 were referring to an officer's progress as his career in the SWP. In April, MI5 were pleased with this very good progress in the SWP. By the autumn of '86, Stefan Veselowski had also managed to find employment at SWP HQ. He too was summoned to an in-person meeting with MI5. It also appears that after Bond's exfiltration at the end of '85, Nick Green had also defied expectations and gained access to headquarters. Stefan Veselowski's deployment lasted until 1988. We are not clear how long he maintained his access to HQ, because the material relating to his deployment has not been disclosed. However, by January 1989, MI5 was so keen on an officer accessing HQ again, they were happy to help pay to facilitate it. When discussing their coverage requirements with the SDS, they indicated that direct access to SWP HQ and the party's computer is of prime importance. MI5 were also very happy that the SDS decided to employ Mark Carey into the SWP. Mark Carey established himself well, and in the SDS words, sucked Lambeth North SWP dry of intelligence. He progressed enough to be involved in an attempt to help set up a new SWP branch in Kingston, but it's not clear that he made it into the SWP HQ. However, in 1990, the SDS were maintaining their target of having 2 officers in the SWP at any one time. Not clear who those officers were, because a number are either giving evidence in closed hearings or were never given nominal identifiers. It may be that an undisclosed officer hit his MI5 target. When Mark Carey was debriefed by MI5 in September 1992, he suggested that black agents stood more chance of getting to SWP's centre. In July 1991, the SDS were now so well practiced in targeting their officers into the centre of the SWP, they were concerned that their black agent, Trevor Morris, might progress too rapidly. and that he could progress into a position with too high a profile. Trevor Morris states that he was a close associate of at least one member of the SWP Central Committee. However, his own declaration of having been a leading SWP member was characteristically hyperbolic, but it certainly ensured he received taxpayer-funded holidays to Germany and Egypt to aid his exfiltration. MI5's interest in HQ continued certainly until 1995, and the fastest routes of securing access to the centre were discussed in their debrief of Trevor Morris. We are unclear as to exactly how many officers the SDS put at the SWP during Tranche 2, but it certainly appears that a minimum of 2 was a standard any one time. It's also apparent that MI5 had their own agents in the SWP over the period. The indiscriminate harvesting of intelligence on the SWP's organisational structure, administration, finances and membership continued. Our provisional and incomplete review of Tranche 2 documents suggests that personal details, employment details and trade union affiliations continue to be a primary focus in the reporting. MI5 certainly required target prioritization of the membership of certain SWP branches to aid their vetting requirements. The sexual abuse of the SWP membership by undercover officers also continued over the period, and we are sure that Category H opening will address the key features such as Alan Bond's fathering the child, one of his SWP targets, and the extent to which that was widely known of throughout the SDS and Special Branch. Alan Bond was a very good friend of Vince Harvey and was the SDS detective inspector for Trevor Morris, both of whom deceived SWP members into sexual relationships. Alan Bond was also good friends with John Dines and Bob Lambert, who Morris also gave character references in his statement, along with a string of other officers, Matt Rayner, Andrew Cole, Jim Boyling and Mark Jenner, together. They have all the hallmarks of a grooming ring. We also raise an issue with respect to Nick Green. When he booked his place at the Skegness Easter Rally in 1985, he booked with a female member of Finchley SWP. He completed their registration on the same form, which was a requirement. They wanted to share a room for the weekend. The inquiry has the woman's details. We asked if inquiries had been made of her. Public order. The SDS annual reports painted a general picture across the decade of the SWP posing even less of an alleged public order threat than in Tranche 1. The annual reports indicated that street activity had markedly declined or made no reference at all to the SWP being involved in disorder. The SWP's focus was said to be on building its base in trade unions and concentrating on building a larger and more politically aware membership. In 1985, the SDS needed to show that the SWP was still a legitimate target, so they stated that they posed a threat to public order, but gave no examples of actual involvement in disorder. In 1988, there was reference to an increased SWP involvement in demonstrations, but again, no examples of any significant disorder. The reported intelligence that the SWP would provoke as much disorder as possible in relation to the poll tax was shown to be sensationalist and inaccurate. In 1989, the SDS admitted that the party did not envisage for one moment the national demonstration would turn into a riot, and when it did, the SWP members present as a whole made no attempt to become actively involved. Instead, the SWP spent a considerable amount of time contemplating, theorising and speculating. The 1990s were no different. In 1990, the SWP took no part as an organisation in any of the disorder that took place, nor did it foresee that any would take place. In 1991, SWP members preferred to sell publications, display banners and chant slogans that indulged in street violence. Generally, the SWP did not pose any major threat to public disorder, and violent behaviour was not a general characteristic amongst the ranks of the SWP or the ANL. Trevor Morris disagreed with the overall SDS assessment based on more than a decade of comprehensive infiltration. Instead, he cited his own stories about the 1993 Welling demonstration as an example. We do not propose to give Mr. Morris forewarning by elaborating here on the questions that we will be asking counsel for the inquiry to pose by the Rule 10 process. We simply say there should be a full and separate public inquiry into the events at Welling in 1993. That inquiry should deal with the full police response to that demonstration. It should consider the accounts and analysis of a wide range of participants. It would not be possible to come to any safe conclusion based on the self-interested account of a serial fantasist and philanderer. In general terms, we've made submissions previously on the manner in which the police could have prevented disorder in relation to the activities of fascist organisations. The Tranche 2 period included the first SDS deployment into a fascist organisation, when Alan Nicholson attempted to infiltrate the British National Party. We have more detailed observations on the SDS and the inquiry's approach to fascist infiltrations that we will make at the beginning of Phase 2, if we are given the opportunity, once we have read and analysed all the material. At this stage, it is apparent that the Nicholson deployment was simply a token infiltration. He was deployed on a part-time basis into a moribund unit of 6 BNP members that was near dormant. He didn't do a single report in his first 3 months. He exfiltrated himself after only 10 months because he was terrified that he'd be killed. He believed he'd been outed to the fascists by another undercover SDS officer. Nicholson's primary conclusion in relation to disorder was that the BNP would try to inflict as much physical harm as possible on left-wing groups. Any SWP paper seller would have given the police the same intelligence. It was clear in 1990-1991 that the BNP was not operating under Loughton when Nicholson was deployed. They were operating out of their headquarters in Welling. If there had been a will to prevent the violence that the fascists were engaging in and inciting at the time, Nicholson would have been sent into south-east London. If operating out of Welling, you would have been, at the very least, would have been able to confirm that the bookshop at Welling was not some sort of mine camp Waterson's. It was fortified like a bunker and was incapable of being torn down or indeed burnt down by demonstrators, as Trevor Morris alleges. Subversion. The Socialist Workers' Party did not threaten the safety or well-being of the state in the Tranche 1 period. It must have been readily apparent that it did not do so in the Tranche 2 period either. In February 1991, the MI5 desk officer in charge of investigating the SWP was Annie Machin. She was tasked to research each area of SW activities, finance, membership, student numbers, and industrial relations, among others, in order to assess whether the party was a threat to national security. Part of her investigation included being the lead of 4 MI5 officers who debriefed Mark Carey in September 1992. After painstaking research and access to the intelligence accrued over the 15 years, the SDS had had almost unbroken access to the SW headquarters, Miss Machin was in no doubt that the SWP was small, relatively poor, and their politics fell outside MI5's criteria for investigation. Their policies advocated educating people so that they could take part in a democratic movement to replace the existing political system. As she said, this was hardly the stuff of revolutionary nightmare. Despite Miss Machin's assessment, senior management and F2 ensured the SWP assumed an increasingly prominent role in the work of the branch and unremittingly applied pressure to beef up the case for the study of the SWP, particularly after its legitimate support for a number of industrial disputes in the early 1990s, which of course posed no threat to national security or parliamentary democracy. Even where the service knew that many individuals attended meetings to protest against specific issues such as the NHS cuts or the poll tax, subjects of legitimate dissent, their details were nevertheless recordable by MI5. It is not surprising that Miss Machin is barely referred to in the statement of witness Y. As we argued in Tranche 1, the true purpose of these SW infiltrations was political, economic, and industrial. In the book, Stasi man Anna Funder comments, the Stasi was the internal army by which the government kept control. Its job was to know everything about everyone, using any means it chose. It knew who your visitors were, it knew who you telephoned, and it knew if your wife slept around. It was a bureaucracy metastasized through East German society, overt and covert. The CMD and SW deployments demonstrate that the SDS was a very British Stasi. So thank you very much for the overtime.
You've extended a little beyond the time that we thought you were going to take, but no matter. May I ask you one question, please?
Yes.
Towards the end of your statement, you said that questions you don't propose to mention in your opening statement, as you haven't,
yes,
the questions that you'll be asking counsel to the inquiry to put to
yes,
Trevor Morris. Because, as you know, Trevor Morris is giving evidence on the 1st and 2nd of August, and his evidence must be completed then, would you be willing to discuss with counsel to the inquiry before then what questions you seek counsel to pose?
So, thank you very much for asking. We've already done so. We've met up already, and we've already spoken on the subject. So, counsel to the inquiry has our suggested areas of questioning.
I'm glad to hear that. Forgive me, your knowledge is greater than mine about some of the details of the conduct of the inquiry, and that's an instance.
That's no problem at all, but I'm very glad you asked us. It's been done. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That concludes proceedings for today. We will resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow with further openings. Thank you.